The Subcommittee on Homeland Security will come to order. As this hearing is being conducted virtually, we must address a few housekeeping matters. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves. When you are recognized to speak, if I notice that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask you if you would like the staff to unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, staff will unmute your microphone. To avoid inadvertent background noise, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participant microphones when they are not recognized to speak. I remind all members and witnesses that the 5-minute clock still applies. If there is a technology issue during a member's speaking time, we will move to the next member until the issue is resolved, and you will retain the balance of your time. You will notice the clock on your screen showing your remaining time. At 1 minute remaining, the clock will turn yellow. At 30 seconds remaining, I will gently tap the gavel to remind the members speaking that their time is almost expired. When your time has expired, the clock will turn red and I will begin to recognize the next member. We will follow the speaking order set forth in the House rules, beginning with the chair and ranking member, followed by members present at the time the hearing is called to order, in order of seniority, and we will alternate by party. Next, we will go to members who were not present when the hearing was called to order until every member present has had a first round. Finally, House rules require me to remind you that we have set up an email address to which members can submit information in writing at any of our hearings or markups. The email address has been provided in advance to your staff. Now let's begin. I welcome everyone to this morning's hearing on management challenges at the Department of Homeland Security. As we approach the 20th anniversary of 9/11, the event that precipitated the formation of the DHS, and after 18 years Congress created the department, it continues to struggle with long-standing and new management challenges. These challenges span from the management of federated component agencies, employee morale, and the evolving nature of new threats to the security of our country. This past year dramatically exemplifies these constantly emerging and daunting threats. When nearly 3,000 Americans were killed on U.S. soil on 9/11, DHS was founded to counter the threat of terrorism from abroad. However, over the course of this year, we experienced weeks in which the daily number of Americans who died of COVID-19 surpassed the tragedy of 9/11. While the threat of foreign-based terrorism continues to be a serious threat, recent events have highlighted the real and growing danger posed by domestic violent extremists. As was discussed during a subcommittee hearing last week, we are also extremely concerned about the very real hazards posed by our vulnerabilities to ever-evolving cybersecurity threats, which were not easily foreseen 20 years ago. Joining us to share their expertise and recommendations on these critical issues, I am pleased to welcome two very distinguished and experienced witnesses. Secretary Michael Chertoff headed the department from 2005 to 2009. He continues to play a role in securing the nation as the co-founder and executive chairman of Chertoff Associates. He is also senior of counsel at the law firm Covington and Burlington. Before his service as DHS secretary, he served for more than a decade as a federal prosecutor and then a federal judge. Secretary Jay Johnson led the department from 2013 to 2017 and serves as a partner in the litigation department of Paul Wise Law Firm. Prior to leading DHS, his accomplishments included both private sector legal work and public sector senior leadership roles at the Departments of Justice and Defense. Each of these men led the vast 22-component agency, 230 employee department. Both have contributed significantly to the development of the department's management functions. As we approach the end of the DHS's second decade in existence. I look forward to hearing their thoughts on what they see as the department's most pressing management challenges and major obstacles and how best to address them. We greatly appreciate you both agreeing to appear before our subcommittee this morning. I would now like to turn to the distinguished gentleman, Mr. Palazzo, for opening remarks, if he has any.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chertoff and Mr. Johnson, for coming today to speak with us regarding management issues within your former departments. Since its inception post 9/11, this department has taken on the crucial task of protecting our homeland and ensuring the safety of the American people. I would say both of you have been successful in that mission, and I thank you for your service to our country. Over the last decade, you have had the firsthand experience of the many challenges our men and women in the department face. As we sit here, our country faces a serious issue at our southern border, cyber threats from our adversaries, and pressures from China near our territories and interests. I look forward to your answers and comments on how we can improve our homeland security and work together on helping the American people. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Secretaries Johnson and Chertoff, we will submit the full text of your official statements for the record. Please begin your oral summary, which I would ask you to keep to 5 minutes. We will proceed in chronological order of service with Secretary Chertoff going first. Secretary Chertoff, please begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Representative Palazzo, and I appreciate the invitation to be here virtually, even if not physically. Let me try to sum up my views in the following statements. First, DHS was founded to deal with all hazards and to protect the United States against all hazards. And that remains, I think, at the core of the mission. Although terrorism was the immediate instigating cause of the department's foundation, there was a clear decision to look at natural disasters and pandemics and other kinds of national systemic threats as part of the mission set for DHS. A second critical element of DHS, which I know both Secretary Johnson and I worked very hard to implement, was the idea of unity of effort, bringing together the various capabilities of the components in a single unified program to respond to particular threats. We saw that in natural disasters, where we were able to use FEMA supplemented with, for example, Customs and Border Protection, the Coast Guard, and other components to respond to emergencies. More recently, as we've seen an elevation of cybersecurity, I want to emphasize that physical security and cybersecurity must go hand in hand, and that often what we see in threats in the cybersphere have a physical element that is part of the attack vector. So one of the reasons I want to say, for the record, I believe it would be a very serious mistake to honor the suggestion of some people that the Secret Service be removed from DHS. The Secret Service plays a critical role in securing the physical environment of our national special security events and other kinds of critical infrastructure, and they work hand in hand with Cisa and other cyber components to do that, and that unity of effort should be preserved. I'll acknowledge in the couple of years, there has been a sense of drift, and I think it's attributable to a number of things, but two in particular. One is there's been an unbelievable leadership turnover at the department. What that's done is robbed the department of confirmed leadership that will be stable, that is able to identify and implement a strategy, and that it has the credibility with the workforce to execute on that strategy. Having people rotating through the secretary's job with temporary appointments that may or may not actually be authorized is designed to undercut the ability of the department to operate as a single unified effort. I would also say that there was, while understandably focus on the border as an important issue, it was treated in many ways as the only issue. and some of the capabilities of other parts of the department were shifted over or subordinated to the border mission. And that ultimately robbed our ability to continue to plan and build capability, our cross-cutting, and we'll deal with many of the issues we have now. So I would suggest that moving forward, we need to do the following. First, Congress needs to make sure there is clarity in the law about succession in the event of vacancies in confirmed positions, and not allow a situation where a future president, not the current one, would decide to use vacancies as a way of simply populating the department with people who will be nothing more than agents to do bidding on particular whims. Second, I think Congress needs to articulate the significance of unity of effort, joint planning, and joint execution at the heart of the department's mission. We have a national incident management system that is supposed to be a cross-cutting way to guarantee that all of the elements, not only of DHS, but of other federal agencies and state agencies, can work together in coordinated fashion. That has to be funded and reinvigorated. Third, we need to broaden the focus on the new set of hazards which have arisen. Some of these are natural hazards, whether it be pandemics or disasters caused by climate change. I think we've seen more of these natural impacts and natural hazards in the last couple of years than I remember seeing in the last 20 years. And this is only going to continue to get worse. So again, the ability to plan, equip, and train to deal with these things must be a priority. And I know Secretary Johnson will remember that both under his tenure and in my tenure, we worked very hard in building and exercising pandemic response plans, but unfortunately they were allowed to lapse. Finally, I would argue there are three new threats that again fall within the domain of DHS that have to be funded and have to be emphasized. One, as the chair said, is domestic terrorism, which is now, in terms of casualties in the US, causing more death than global jihadism that we dealt with 20 years ago. That problem is not going away. And in conjunction with the FBI and state and local law enforcement, we have to be prepared to address it. Second, as demonstrated by solar winds and other attacks, including an attack on a water system in Florida, cyber attacks are becoming more and more dangerous, more and more frequent, and the scale is increasing. And adequately funding and giving authorities to Cisa, working with the Secret Service to respond to those attacks, is probably the number one hazard that requires urgent action. And finally, both foreign adversaries and domestic actors are engaging in disinformation campaigns and attacks on our democracy. And while our physical security is obviously critical, the security of our Constitution and our constitutional values is also, in my view, part of the responsibility of DHS. So there is plenty to do, but I will leave by saying I still believe that the vast majority of people who work at the agency are committed to the mission. If given proper leadership and direction and support, will happily execute that mission. And all of us depend upon the ability of the department to do its work. So with that, I thank you very much, and I look forward to answering questions.
Thank you. Secretary Johnson, please begin.
Thank you very much. Let me begin by apologizing for the darkness in my office here. It's a little hard to see me, but at least you get a panoramic view of Midtown Manhattan. I'm sitting in my law office in New York City. Madam Chair, Ranking Member Palazzo, it's good to see so many friends of mine on the subcommittee. As a matter of reflex, so I've been in private life for 4 years now. When the appropriators call, I still respond. I welcome the opportunity to testify at this hearing concerning management challenges at DHS. I also welcome the opportunity to testify alongside my good friend and predecessor, Mike Chertoff. Though we served administrations of different parties, Mike and I have often collaborated on a number of projects and events. As you know, DHS is the third largest cabinet department of our government. It is a fraction of the size of the Department of Defense, where I served as general counsel from 2009 to 2012. But in many respects, it feels much larger. Without a doubt, DHS is the most decentralized cabinet department with the most diffuse set of missions and workplace cultures, all under the umbrella of Homeland Security, ranging from Cisa, TSA, the Coast Guard, where my son serves, and the United States Secret Service. No matter whether you regard DHS as too big or too small, the reality, however, is that DHS's current structure is outdated to meet all current Homeland Security threats. DHS was created in the wake of 9/11, as you all know, principally for the counterterrorism mission. In 2002, terrorism was regarded primarily as an extraterritorial threat. The view then was that the consolidation into one cabinet-level department of the regulation of all the different ways a person can enter our homeland, land, sea, or air, is the effective way to counter terrorism. Now, almost 20 years later, we know that the principal terrorist threats to our homeland are domestic-based. In recent years, most attacks have been committed by domestic groups or individuals, not by those directed or inspired by foreign terrorist organizations. Beyond that are the other serious threats to our homeland security, namely COVID-19, cybersecurity, climate change, and other things. The Department of Homeland Security must meet all these challenges, plus administer and enforce our immigration laws. But DHS has in recent years been under constant siege and in constant crisis, while suffering from management upheaval and leadership vacancies. Over the last 50 months, there have been nine people, including myself and the incumbent, to occupy the role of Secretary of Homeland Security. 4 Senate confirmed and 5 acting. Over the last 4 years of the Trump administration, there was no Senate confirmed director of ICE at all. There have been public calls, as you know, for the elimination of certain components of DHS, or the casting off of certain components of DHS, and even the elimination of DHS in its entirety. In the current environment, it is easy to forget that DHS is responsible for the vital missions of protecting the American people and their homeland from land, sea, and air, and in cyberspace. The Coast Guard performs the vital maritime safety, national security, law enforcement, and counter-drug functions. The Secret Service protects the president and others. TSA provides basic aviation security to Americans every day. FEMA is the nation's disaster response agency. CISA is the U.S. government's primary information exchange hub for the nation's cybersecurity. These are matters in which politics should play little role and around which there should be bipartisan consensus and support. You have my extended prepared statement in which I put forth a number of observations and recommendations, places where I think DHS has improved and where it still has a challenge. I look forward to answering your questions and our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Secretary Johnson, there's been a long-standing criticism about how DHS was created and structured by combining multiple, somewhat disparate agencies into a new department without giving its leadership sufficient authority to exert effective control over components which too often operated independently. You attempted to address this with your Unity of Effort initiative. Unfortunately, much of the progress that you made seems to have been lost since your departure. Both you and Secretary Chertoff served as senior advisor board co-chairs of the Atlantic Council Future of DHS project, which issued a number of recommendations in December, including ones focused on internal challenges. Importantly, it recommended that policy and budget officials work more closely together. Do you agree that a power imbalance exists between headquarters and the components? And if so, what reforms are needed, either statutorily or administratively, to address the problem?
I do agree with that statement. When I got to DHS in 2013, frankly, I was surprised to find out that the budget process was still very stovepiped, The acquisition process lacked maturity. We, in my 3 years, revised the budget making process to focus more on missions than components, and told the components to bring forth budgets that took account of overlap. Let's focus on the mission. As you probably know, and I know Henry knows, we created joint task forces for border security on our southern border. Congress in the NDAA one year actually codified joint task forces into law. Regrettably, it's my understanding that they have been disbanded or not used. I think the answer to your question is that there has to be a commitment across several administrations to keep in place certain things to give the department wide more authority over the components. If it's simply not enough time for one cabinet secretary over one 3 or 4 year period to try to change all of this. There has to be a multi-administration commitment to doing so. And I think the answer there is Congress. Congress can take care through codification of a lot of this, that multiple administrations pay attention to reforming the department and making it function better.
Secretary Chertoff, it's been several years now since you left the department. How would you rate the department's management progress over the years, and what would you recommend as the top management reform for the current secretary?
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I agree with what Secretary Johnson, my friend and successor, said. I certainly think we've slipped back over the last 4 years. And as I indicated, I think one of the critical reasons is that there was such churn in the leadership that the message went out to some of the component heads that they didn't really need to pay attention to what the secretary said, because that job was going to change in about 10 minutes. So I do think having consistency in leadership is critical, but I would also agree that we ought to codify the need for having coordinated unity of effort within the department. And frankly, one of the reasons we've had a problem with that is there are so many different authorizing committees which exert jurisdiction over the department, which gives some of the components the feeling that if they don't succeed with one committee, they can run to another committee and get support there. I think combining the authorization into a single oversight committee for Homeland Security would be a big step forward in getting this unity of effort.
Mr. Palazzo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just to follow up on what Secretary Chertoff just mentioned, I believe what he just described, if we could codify the authorizing committees under one committee of jurisdiction, it would save a lot of the problems. And that's also one of the last 9/11 Commission findings that has not been implemented, if I recall that from my time on the Homeland Security Authorizing Committee. So Secretary Chertoff, thank you for bringing that up. You know, I've been very focused on two borders, the maritime border and the southern border. And, you know, when we focus on the southern border, we have a tendency to not focus on the maritime border. And we know those who are trying to find their way into our country, whether it's to work, smuggling hard narcotics, foreign nationals, or human trafficking, they're going to find a way. So we got to be cognizant of all of our borders. And I love the way you describe the air, the land, the sea, and space is an important mission. And as secretaries, both of you, I mean, you had a huge monumental task, you know, under the Homeland Security Department, because it covers so many various responsibilities. But I would like to just direct my questions to Secretary Johnson. You know, you're probably familiar with the National Security Cutter. You know, it's crazy that Homeland, you deal with flood insurance, you get a question on flood insurance under FEMA, and next thing you get a shipbuilding question for the Coast Guard. But can you tell me how beneficial the National Security Cutter has been filling in the gaps for the United States Navy, but also fighting the war on drugs? I mean, sometimes they're the only American presence in South and Central America. and they have stopped and prohibited tons of cocaine and hard narcotics from finding its way into America. So can you take a moment and just share your thoughts on the National Security Cutter program?
Yes, I've been aboard several NSCs. It's a wonderful vessel. First time I was on the Stratton in 2015, which is in Alameda, California, I wanted to meet the master helmsman of the ship, this 400-foot cutter. And they brought her up for me. She was 19 years old. She had just finished high school the year before, but she had demonstrated her acumen on the bridge, and they made her the master helmsman. It's a wonderful testament to what someone can do in a short period of time. Sir, I will tell you this. I know that the Coast Guard is very busy in the Pacific Ocean with drug interdiction. The cartels are active to this day. One Coast Guard unit of 8 people on board the Gabrielle Giffords, a littoral combat ship, seized $290 million worth of cocaine. That's public information. They were very busy. As you probably know, the Coast Guard serves in the Persian Gulf as well, supporting the Navy, supporting the security of the Navy, which over the last year or so was a particularly intense mission. When I came into office, I learned that the Coast Guard has the oldest fleet of vessels of any Navy in the world. And we need to recapitalize, we need to continue that effort. When I was secretary, there were efforts to try to cut back on NSCs, on the OPCs, the mid-size cutter. I think we need to keep at this. People forget the Coast Guard is not just maritime security, pulling somebody out of the water when their jet ski capsizes. It is a vital national security mission on the 1-yard line, not the 30-yard line, not the 50-yard line, but on the 1-yard line. So I could not agree more with the spirit of your question, sir.
Well, thank you, Secretary Johnson, for sharing that. You know, the national security cutters, and we've seen this. They pay for themselves. Just in the drugs that they take off the ocean before they find their way into America's backyards, destroying families, destroying communities. They pay for themselves, and we still have the same issues with OMB, and people, they're not requesting them in their budget because they know Congress will find a way to fund the Coast Guard shipbuilding program. But I wish, the fact that the Coast Guard currently is actually deploying to counter China in areas of our country. It's just amazing what they've done. And so again, thank you, and I'll save my questions for the second round. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Mr. Cuellar.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I also want to thank both secretaries. It's always a pleasure. I think both of you understood the balance between security and letting legitimate goods and people into the United States. So I appreciate both of y'all understanding that balance, because there are a tendency that people push too much to one side and not understand that. As the chairwoman said a few minutes ago, and Secretary Johnson, actually my first question had to do with the unity of effort. And along with that, as you mentioned, if we don't do that, as you know, there are several overarching Homeland Security missions, and especially if you're talking about security, border security, how do you go ahead and put all that together? You're right. I got calls back in November, December, that they were dissolving the Joint Task Force West. And I thought it was a mistake, but as you know, it was something that got done by the prior administration. So my question, I would ask you and Secretary Chertoff, if you want to add on this, should we put back the Joint Task Force again? I assume both of you will say yes, and tell us why that's important. Question number one, and then question number two for both of us, for both of y'all, temporary travel restrictions. the balance between letting people in and how do we secure the border. As you know, this March, in about a week, we will have 1 year of not letting the legal visa holders from Canada and from Mexico come into the United States. They can fly in from Mexico, but they cannot drive across. And I'm talking about what they call non-essential, which is, in my opinion, very important, because before the pandemic, Mexicans would spend 18 million Mexicans will come over and spend over $19 billion. Laredo, about 45–50% of all the retail is made by Mexican shoppers. So there's got to be a way that we can safely let people in into the United States and still help our economy. So I don't know if y'all are familiar with that particular border restrictions, but if y'all want to answer both questions, and thank you for both of y'all for being on board with us.
I'll start if I could. First time I went to the southern border to Texas was in 2014, early 2014. And I met in a large conference room at the Border Patrol station with everybody who was devoted to the effort on the southern border at that moment. You had Border Patrol, you had Air and Marine in the brown uniforms, you had the Customs in the blue uniforms, we had FEMA, we had USCIS, we had ICE ERO, like 30 different people from 10 different components of DHS. And the oddity that struck me was that I was the only person in their chain of command that they had in common, me, the person at the very top of that organization. We were way too stovepipe. And so we created joint task forces modeled after a pilot program in Arizona that was working well, and modeled, frankly, after my experience in the Department of Defense with joint command structures. I thought it made a tremendous amount of sense. But when something is new, you're always going to have bureaucratic resistance to change. And so unless there is a sustained commitment to getting used to things in a new manner, it's gonna fall apart. And that's exactly what happened over the last 4 years, to the detriment, in my view, of border security. On the travel restrictions, the one thing I'll add there is it's not an all or nothing proposition. You can have travel restrictions that are very targeted, very nuanced, like, for example, instead of just banning all travel from a certain country, you can funnel people into certain airports. The Secretary of Homeland Security actually has the authority to require that passengers coming from a particular country only land at 2 or 3 airports in this country where they might receive a heightened health screening. That's what we did during the Ebola crisis in 2014. And so travel need not be an all or nothing proposition. Over to Mike.
I agree with what's been said. Let me just, on the travel point, make the observation that as we get more vaccinated people, having some kind of a travel document or even electronic travel record that indicates that you're vaccinated could be an important element in allowing for your travel. I would also say you need to look at this issue, which kind of is, I'm not quite sure it's been implemented, but it's been discussed, which is a rule that would say that even US citizens or permanent residents returning from overseas can't board the plane or can't come in unless they're tested. And if they test positive, they have to stay in the foreign country until they test negative. And I have to say, now putting on my hat as a former judge, I'm wondering at the legality of saying over an extended period of time to Americans, not that they have to quarantine themselves, but that they have to quarantine themselves outside the US. So again, having a consistent policy that doesn't overreact, I think is going to be very important as we hopefully emerge from this.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, you're muted.
Mr. Fleischman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I apologize profusely to you and the members of the subcommittee. Madam Chair, I was working on an issue that you and I have discussed before. And so my profuse apologies. To Secretary Chertoff, thank you very much for your outstanding service to our country. I did not have the pleasure to serve with you. I thank you for being here today. Secretary Johnson, I want to specifically and profusely thank you. I had the privilege of serving on this subcommittee with you, and I also want to thank you for giving back. Even during the last administration, you were always very kind with your time and advice, and I appreciate your great dedication to not only to this issue, but to our nation, sir, and I thank you. I'll start with some questions. As you know, the situation at the southwest border is escalating to be a crisis greater than we saw in 2019. I was there just this weekend. It's scary. Think of any negative adjective, and it is there. Should there be a set of criteria that triggers action like FEMA Stafford Act declaration that gets put into motion when apprehensions reach a certain number, or time and custody measures exceed thresholds, or intel about activities in Central America and Mexico alert that caravans are en route? And I'll defer to both gentlemen.
I can begin. I think Representative Fleshman, yes, the short answer is, and I know FEMA has now been mobilized. The challenge is, how do you deal when you have an expansion of particularly unaccompanied minors, and you need to have humane and secure facilities in which they can be kept while they're being processed. Now, I understand from what Secretary Mayorkas said the other day, that there are, for adults and families, people simply being expelled and being sent back either into Mexico or to their home countries. But it's not always possible to do that. And particularly with the pandemic, having safe and secure facilities becomes important. And they have to be humane. So I think there's a challenge in scaling up. And part of the planning process, which I talked about earlier, is you've got to have standby plans for dealing with these kinds of surges, much as we do in hurricane season, when we understand we may have to do evacuations on a large scale. So I would agree this ought to be part of this unity of effort we've been talking about.
Thank you, sir. Secretary Johnson.
Congressman, nice to see you again.
Yes, sir.
I was just in your home state a couple of weeks ago. My father passed away and we buried him in his hometown of Nashville. So I had an opportunity to visit your state just recently, though it was a sad occasion. As I listened to your question, it occurred to me that it is appropriate to have in place mechanisms to deal with a border surge, like invoking FEMA, like invoking Title 42, public health care laws. I would not adopt specific triggers for those measures. I would leave it to the discretion of the Secretary of DHS to invoke them depending upon circumstances. So, for example, 2 years ago, if we had tried to develop specific benchmarks for when we would invoke FEMA or doing other things, I suspect very few of us would have anticipated a global pandemic like the one we're facing now. And so I would leave it discretionary in terms of when emergency authorities are invoked, of course, always with the oversight of Congress.
Thank you, sir. And in the interest of time, I will yield back with our condolences, Mr. Secretary, on the passing of your father. Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
Ms. Underwood.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for calling today's hearing. As the Department of Homeland Security nears the end of its second decade, I look forward to working with the committee and the administration to help the department mature its mission and organization. I think it's important to know exactly what we're talking about when we refer to the department's mission. Mr. Johnson, you oversaw an update to the department's mission statement in consultation with Mr. Chertoff and the other former secretaries. That mission, which is still in effect today, is, quote, "With honor and integrity, we will safeguard the American people, our homeland, and our values." And I'm interested in hearing more about how the department's work at the border fits into that mission. When you served as secretary, you testified to Congress that DHS was committed to providing for migrant safety, security, and medical needs, and to treating all individuals with dignity and respect. Mr. Johnson, can you elaborate on why basic medical care is such a critical part of the mission of safeguarding both our values and our safety?
I agree with that statement. People under our care and custody, and we're most often talking about families and children, deserve, in my opinion, as a matter of basic humanity, health care. They deserve a certain level of health care. We're facing COVID-19 right now. I cannot begin to comprehend the complexity of dealing with a border surge on top of COVID-19. I believe that the question you raise requires further study. I believe that Congress should consider calling upon DHS to address exactly what levels of healthcare should be provided to migrants who have been apprehended at the border, particularly when you're dealing with a situation like the one we have right now.
And can you briefly explain what the function of the chief medical officer is and how that office fits into the department's mission of safeguarding our values?
I dealt most often with the chief medical officer during the Ebola crisis of 2014. She was in my office every day and was critical in terms of the advice she provided to me and to our components wrestling with the issue. We had many medical experts across the federal government and HHS, including Dr. Fauci, who was at the table in 2014 in the Situation Room. But it was good to have in a public health challenge like the one we had in 2014, our own in-house chief medical officer and advisor.
Right. So how did that person help you in terms of safeguarding the values?
In terms of safeguarding the values, I would say that it goes very much to the honor and integrity of those who work at DHS. Honor and integrity includes treating people humanely, in my judgment. Incidentally, I wrote that statement and I'm glad it's still part of DHS's mission.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I'm also conscious of the medical needs of DHS staff whose work often puts them on the front lines of the pandemic. Mr. Johnson, as a former leader of the DHS workforce, would you agree that vaccinating its own frontline workers should be a top priority of the department right now?
Yes.
And do you have any explanation about why that might be so important?
For the reasons you just stated, they're on the front lines. They're on the front lines dealing with vast numbers of people at the ports, the land borders, and they're essential government workers. I don't know why they wouldn't be a priority.
Yes, sir. It's certainly at the front of my mind as I think about how DHS's medical leadership could be strengthened and empowered to support ongoing efforts to care for both department staff and the migrants they encounter. This issue is more urgent than ever as we look to the current situation at the southern border. The damage done to our immigration system by the previous administration was profound, and it will take time to rebuild the capacity to process migrants in a humane way at the scale currently required. Providing appropriate medical care to these migrants is an essential part of humane treatment, and it's key to our national security. If we fail to meet migrants' basic health needs, especially during a pandemic that threatens public health and makes Americans, including the DHS officials and law enforcement officers who interact with them, it makes our country less safe. Each component within the department has a different mission and interacts with migrants in different ways. So, quote, appropriate care can mean different things. In some cases, it means initial medical screening. In others, it means influenza vaccinations or COVID testing. I think it's time to assess how medical care is managed department-wide and consider whether the current organizational structure is adequate to protect public health along our border and achieve the mission of safeguarding our values. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being with us today. I yield back.
Okay. Mr. Price.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome to our two former secretaries, both of whom I have fond memories of working with very cooperatively when I was chair and ranking member of this subcommittee. Both of you have referred in your statements to the preoccupation of the last administration with immigration, and you've portrayed that as working to the detriment of other departmental priorities and functions. I'm presuming you mean by that not just the degree of attention given to immigration, but also major changes in policy. After all, it hasn't been that long since Secretary Chertoff was the leader of a Republican administration's efforts to achieve comprehensive immigration reform. We're certainly a long way from that now. And on the Hill here, we've seen Homeland Security, this subcommittee, go from being the least controversial of our appropriations bills to the most controversial. And the reason for that is solely immigration. Now we're moving back to a more balanced view of immigration at the top of the administration. But there are many reminders of the divisiveness and the toxicity of the Trump policy, many reminders on the ground, many reminders in this body, and many reminders at DHS. And that's what I want to ask you both about. In the culture of DHS, you've seen the troubling reports of punitive attitudes and behavior trickling down to the front lines of DHS agencies. You know the controversies about what kind of restraints are honored, what kind of norms are respected with respect to the treatment of desperate people. For example, the separation of families. There's a question of the agency's discretion, the department's discretion. And there are lots of discretion that's exercised, as both of you very well know, in setting priorities, for example, for enforcement and deportation, in dealing with local law enforcement, how to deal with local law enforcement, and so on. So it's been a traumatic 4 years. And my question to you in terms of management challenges is, what do those challenges look like as a result in the immigration area? Particularly, we're talking about the culture of the department. We're talking about the level of morale. We're talking about the discipline within the department. We're talking about the sense of the department's mission. We're talking about its legitimacy in the society. Looks to me like a long list of challenges, and I would very much value your reflections on them. Mike, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, let me go first. Congressman, it's great to be dealing with you again, and I do have fond memories of doing that. And I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think this is a very challenging, it's like turning a big ship around. It's not going to happen on a dime. And I know Secretary Mayorkas recognizes this. I mean, I saw that not only in his statement, but in conversations I've had with him. So let me be blunt. The prior administration treated wanton cruelty and disdain as actually policy tools in what I think was a deeply misguided effort to discourage unauthorized migration, and also, frankly, to clamp down on legal migration, including visas and similar types of legal mechanisms. And there was a manifest hostility that was articulated from the very top of the administration. So the first thing that needs to happen is there needs to be a reframing of the narrative, and understanding that we still need to have borders that we secure. We need to make the decision who gets admitted and who doesn't. But we also honor our obligations to refugees and to asylum. We recognize that there are some important reasons to have immigrants come in, either on a temporary basis or even ultimately to be on a permanent basis. And we need to express that in word and deed in a way that's not unduly encouraging people to think it's open borders, because that's not helpful either. If the smugglers all of a sudden get the opportunity to smuggle, vastly more people to the border and make money off of it, and then those people wind up getting sent back, the only winners are the smugglers. So this is a daunting challenge to calibrate the message to be clear and balanced. And at the same time, I think we need to look more generally at the system as a whole. And this is an issue that Congress visited multiple times. When I was secretary, President Bush was very interested in pushing this. It's got to be some combination of legal mechanisms for people who are filling employment needs in the US or have other humanitarian reasons to come in, but also to enforce the rules so that it doesn't just become willy-nilly, everybody comes in when they feel like it. And I think this is going to require an all-hands-on-deck approach at the department. As I said earlier, migration is not the only mission, but it certainly will be, at least for the foreseeable future, one of the things that's on the front burner.
Good morning, David. I'm going to answer your question with two comments. First, in my experience, you talked about the culture of the Border Patrol and others. In my experience, working at DHS, in November 2014, we adopted new priorities for deportation, for enforcement. They were very clear, they were very concise. Before I even issued them, I spent hours with our enforcement personnel, with ICRO, with the Border Patrol leadership, CBP leadership, as well as people advising me who reflected more so the viewpoints on the left. And we collaborated on those priorities, and people like Tom Homan will say, and Tom was the head of ICRO when I was there, he's now a Fox commentator, he will say, and he has said publicly, that not everything he advocated made it into our enforcement priorities, but he was very comfortable adopting them, implementing them, supporting them, and explaining them to his workforce. So in answer to the first part of your question, in my experience, if you have a leadership style that is collaborative, inclusive, and people feel like they've been heard, they're prepared to support what you do, even though it's not exactly what they would do. Big picture on the issue of immigration, on the issue of our southern border, in my experience, and part of this I learned from just listening to Michael Chertoff and his advice. In my experience, the things you could do at our southern border to heighten enforcement, heighten border security, that may have an effect in the short term, but as long as the conditions in Central America and in Mexico persist long term, we're going to be dealing with illegal migration because people in that region of the country are making the very basic choice to flee a burning building. And there's no amount of deterrence, border security, or a wall that will stop them. We have to address the problems in Central America. We began that effort in 2016 with an appropriation of $750 million. I'm told by experts that that money, though it was a drop in the bucket, was beginning to make a difference. And I think we need to stay that course. We have to give people in Central America a reason to want to stay. And that's the only way, in my observation, we're going to deal with this problem long term. Over.
Thank you.
Mr. Rutherford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me first say I agree completely with Mr. Johnson's last soliloquy there about the Central America, South America, and our need to address their social issues. And I think we've had some good success in those countries like Colombia, Honduras, but more needs to be done. And in fact, I think Secretary Mattis, when he was talking about the military, said it best of all. He said, if you're going to cut the State Department budget, which is where these funds would come from to assist down there, if you're going to cut the State Department budget, buy me more bullets. Because I think he understood that we have got to be about winning the hearts and minds of people around the world and lifting people out of poverty. The fact of the matter is, capitalism has lifted more people out of poverty than any other economic system in the world. And so that's one reason we need to keep our economy strong. But I can tell you, as a lifelong police officer, what concerns me and what I see at the border going on, this policy, you know, Mr. Chertoff, you were talking about a policy that was inhumane, I'll paraphrase, in that it discouraged people from coming. I think it's inhumane that we have a policy now that is encouraging people to come into desperate situations. And so as a law enforcement officer, my greatest concern with DHS and CBP is, what are we doing after 9/11? DHS, we have to remember this. After 9/11, DHS was formed because we had all these agencies that were working in silos. And the challenge within law enforcement is not lack of information, it's turning that information into intelligence through good analytical tools. And so we missed a lot. And so I'm afraid with this massive humanity that's coming across the border down there right now, that is a crisis, that's completely policy driven. We need to know that you know, everybody is sharing information, because we just captured 4 folks off the terrorist watch list coming across down there. I'm very familiar with the opioids. My hometown, Jacksonville, Florida, had the highest opioid death rate from fentanyl and opioids back just a year ago. And so I know a little bit about these drugs and the cartels that are bringing them and children across our borders. So my question is, what system does DHS have in place to help communicate with state and local partners? And how are they making sure that we're not going back to those pre-9/11 silos of information? And Mr. Johnson, if you'd like to start.
Sure thing, yes. What the principal objective of the Intelligence and Analysis Directorate is vertical information sharing. When I was ramping up for my job, I asked, what does DHS need with an intelligence directorate? And I was told vertical information sharing with state and local law enforcement. So if they're failing in that mission, they're failing in their principal mission. But I want to go back to something you said about intelligence from Central America, which really rings a bell with me. When I was in office, I used to urge our intelligence community, can you please devote some of your resources to helping me in Central America? It wouldn't be that hard to find out what the coyotes are saying on the streets of Guatemala to people about why they should come to the United States. That way I know what's coming before it shows up on our front door in Texas or Arizona. Devote resources from the intelligence community so that we can see these waves before they show up. And so, and I would urge Congress to urge the intelligence community to do the same thing. It shouldn't be that first sign of a wave of 100,000 people in a month is when they show up at the holding stations in McAllen or Brownsville or El Paso.
Thank you. The only thing I would say to that is we've seen the caravan coming for quite some time, but you're right. The genesis of it is what I'd like to see us get down to. So thank you, Mr. Johnson, and seeing Madam Chair, my time has run out, so I yield back.
Mr. Ruppersberger.
Yep, am I on?
Yeah, you're on.
Yeah, am I on now? Well, first, I want to thank you all for your service in the past. The Department of Homeland Security really was stood up after 9/11, and a lot of different agencies and different missions. I think, thank God, we had the Coast Guard, which was a well-managed operation that kind of led the charge. And then when you all came into leadership, I think you both, based on your past experience, just did a lot to build on where we need to go. As far as when I came to this subcommittee, one of my tasks was to equip and resource the department properly so we could meet the moment on the federal government cybersecurity challenges and coordinate better with state and local governments and private sector. Now, I have to give a great deal of credit to the leadership of this subcommittee now and in the past, and the full committee. I think we've taken Cisa from around 1.5 billion to now well over 2.2 billion, and we just gave them an additional 650 million in the American Rescue Plan passed last week. But one of my questions to Cisa last week was when can we expect them to submit their posture review as required by the FY21 NDAA, so this subcommittee can have a better idea of resource planning well into the future. And I think what I'm really concerned about is that the mission that Cisa has as far as Homeland Security and cybersecurity is massive. I happen to represent NSA. They're in my district, and I was one time ranking on the Intel Committee. And I think NSA, until recently, was right on their game as it related to Russia and China. I'm a little concerned about the attacks, the Russia attacks, that now the Chinese, as far as our defense is concerned. And I think we have a little bit more to do in that regard. But what do you think of the future of Cisa? How well do you think they're managed internally in the department? How do we see their ability to take on federal government to the cybersecurity mission? And it increasingly grows larger and more complex. And hopefully we would never have another world war, but I see a lot of it in the cyberspace and in the space itself. Now, how should we approach my question, the fine line of giving Cisa the tools to do the job, but not directly competing with a robust U.S. cybersecurity service market private sector. And the one thing that I've put on the table is that I feel that the cybersecurity issue is so large, and we just created a space force. I think there's a need to have cybersecurity set out in maybe another area with a direct line to the administration. And because of all the areas and issues that we're going to deal with in the future. We keep growing, and we're getting attacked now on a regular basis. So if you could just give me your opinion on that, the possibility of taking cybersecurity into another level. Then, start, I guess, with Mr. Johnson and then Mr. Chertoff.
Thank you for that question, Congressman. First of all, regrettably, the executive branch often does not take congressional deadlines seriously. The last QHSR was supposed to be every 5 years, but the last one was the one that I helped write in 2014. So, and going through the exercise of delivering to Congress a report on the future is a worthwhile exercise because it forces us to focus on that as an agency or as a department. My general assessment of Cisa is that it's going in the right direction. I'm pleased that Congress approved reorganizing from NPPD, which was a cumbersome directorate, to an agency devoted to cybersecurity and infrastructure protection. I think Chris Krebs did a good job. I think that Cisa did a good job preparing us for the 2020 election in terms of election infrastructure. They worked effectively with state and local election officials on that. The report that was declassified yesterday indicates that there was no attack on our election infrastructure per se, but there's still a lot of work to do. The SolarWinds attack was, in my observation, the most devastating cyber attack on our nation in perhaps in history. The big challenge that I see for DHS, and I would not re-wicker the structure right now. I'd give the current alignment time to stabilize. The biggest challenge that DHS has is talent, as you suggested. Just on my watch, some of our best cybersecurity people were stolen away by the financial services sector, who could pay them 2 or 3 times what the government pays them. And my approach has been, come and serve your country for just a couple of years. Give us your expertise for just a couple of years before you go off and work at Goldman Sachs or Citigroup or the defense industry, and learn from working for our country the insights there. But recruiting and retaining talent, in my judgment, in cybersecurity is our biggest challenge.
And an example, Chris Krebshaw, I think, did an excellent job. He moved forward, and because he made the comment that he felt that the election was secure, which is not what Trump was putting out for whatever reason, and he got fired. And that inconsistency of leadership is not good either. So I agree with all of your comments, and we're losing good people. We just need some smart people in the cyber field to stay 3-4 years.
I believe that ends our first round, and we do have some time for a second round. So I would like to talk a little bit about employee morale. Each year since the creation of DHS, based on the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey conducted by the Office of Personnel Management, employee morale has consistently ranked among the worst in the federal government. I know that you, Secretary Johnson and Secretary Chertoff, have worked very hard to address this issue during your tenure, but the problem still persists. Secretary Johnson, what responsibility does the departmental management have in addressing this issue, and what steps should be taken by today's leaders within the department to address the systemic low morale? And is there anything that Congress can do to help?
When I came into office, I was beaten over the head by Congress during my confirmation process about improving morale. It was at the bottom of the list in terms of cabinet departments, and I was going to raise morale if it killed me. My third year in office, according to Febs, morale within DHS, which is no small lift because you're talking about multiple components, went up a whole 3 percentage points. Interestingly, the most dramatic increase was in ICE, my last year of office, 7 whole percentage points. And morale is not just a general indicator of whether the workforce believes in their mission, but it also is a recruitment tool. It also reflects directly on the prestige of the agency. And morale has, according to, if you look at Febs from 2016, we bottomed out in 2016, and it has increased steadily ever since. It has to be a focused, sustained commitment to paying attention to this issue. I believe that the current human capital officer, Angie Bailey, has done an excellent job. She was hired in 2015 or 2016. I think she's doing an excellent job. In terms of what Congress can do, I'll tell you one episode. I came to work one morning and I read in the Washington Post that a subcommittee, I can't remember which one it was holding a hearing on worst places to work in the federal government. And one of my people had been called to testify because Congress was going to highlight that DHS was one of the worst places to work in the federal government. And I said to my staff, let's not send so-and-so, I will go. And I got lots of pushback from my staff, but I went anyway. And I said to the chair of the subcommittee at the time, Mr. Meadows, would you please stop holding hearings telling people how terrible it is to work at DHS? That doesn't help me. Help me. And so I'm glad that we were able to finally turn the corner. It's a sustained effort, and it's a very, very big agency, and leadership on this must have a cascading effect. You've got to get the component leaders to focus on it, their subordinates and their subordinates, and it has to trickle down through the organization.
Secretary Chertoff, do you have any recommendations?
No, I agree with it does require sustained effort and appreciation being shown not just by the leadership of the department, but by the leadership of the administration. I recognize that one of the challenges is that the people at some of the components are interacting with the public under circumstances in which the public is usually a little bit grumpy. For example, TSA, nobody really likes the experience at the airport, and TSA is really right in the front lines of that. Likewise, CBP, the border inspectors run up against people who are tired and a little bit cranky. So we need to recognize that maybe with the possible exception of IRS, there's no federal agency that has as much direct, repeated, and sometimes challenging contact with the public as does DHS. But with that, I agree, emphasizing and celebrating the importance of the mission and highlighting where the mission has made a difference in a positive way is one thing I would like to see as a response to this challenge.
Okay. DHS has gone through a number of reorganizations since it was first established. And there have been various suggestions made, such as I think Secretary Chertoff, you mentioned the fact that there was discussion about moving the Secret Service. And there have been also calls to dissolve the department and move its operations to other departments and agencies. What is the argument for maintaining DHS as a federal department? And are additional organizational changes needed to ensure its success?
So I can be very succinct. First, I think the department, if it's being led properly, does foster unity of effort among a number of the components that complement each other. For example, some of the capabilities and tools TSA has are shared with CBP and vice versa. And that means that we're able to both strengthen our border for air travelers and our aircraft and airplane security for our air travelers. As I said earlier, the Secret Service and its capabilities in the area of personal protection and physical security mesh very well with other missions of the department at Cisa that are also focused on the issue of critical infrastructure. If you separate these out, you're not going to make the mission disappear. You're just going to make it very difficult to coordinate, and everybody's going to pursue their own thing. So I think it would be a tragic mistake to go back to the old days when we actually promoted stovepipes and separation. Finally, I would say, as a general matter, reorganizations cost time, money, and always set us back in progress. So I don't know that I would do any significant reorganizing, even within the department. What's needed now is consistency of leadership, strategic vision, clear communication, and attention to execution.
I see that my time is up, but I would like to ask Secretary Johnson if he has any thoughts on the subject.
Yes. Well, first of all, on the subject of morale, I think the single best thing I did was one day, I don't know if you can see this, one day I went to BWI and I literally put on a TSA uniform and worked the line. I played undercover boss, and all the TSA officers loved it. And I think it was a good shot for morale. From where I sat as secretary, I thought it made a tremendous amount of sense for one person to have eyes and ears on all the different ways somebody can enter our country, land, sea, and air. And there's a very practical benefit to having Secret Service and HSI and all these other components in one place. When you have large national security events, like a papal visit or a UN General Assembly, the Secret Service has the lead, but it draws upon all these other DHS components to augment the security mission, which would be very difficult if they're spread across multiple cabinet departments. So that's the one thing I'd like to add to what Michael said. Michael and I, we co-authored an op-ed about keeping the Secret Service within DHS, and I'm glad that in Congress that effort seems to have been set aside for the time being.
Mr. Fleischman.
Thank you again, Madam Chair. Components submit their annual budget requests to DHS headquarters budget office and ultimately through OMB. Unfortunately, due to the highly politicized environment we currently live in, the priorities of an individual agency may get shelved in favor of the highest priorities of the department or the executive branch. Currently, only one DHS agency provides a list of priorities that were not included in the budget justifications. The Coast Guard submits an unfunded priority list that helps the committee undertake our own evaluation of needs and investments. But we have cybersecurity investments at Cisa that can't always be accommodated, or technology and infrastructure improvements we should be investing in at the borders, and we are not always given information about those needs through the budget process if we can't see what trade-offs were made during formulation. Well, the Coast Guard has significantly higher capital and infrastructure investment needs than many of the other agencies. Do you feel it would be advantageous and in the interest of greater transparency for other agencies within DHS to submit a similar report to Congress, for example, CISA and CBP? And I would like both gentlemen's response, please.
Can I start?
Yes, sir.
My answer is no.
Okay.
From where I sat as the secretary, and from where I sat in DOD leadership, I think that unfunded priority list mean the secretary and OMB lose control of the process. I'm being very blunt here. This originated in the Department of Defense, and somebody's got to look at the big picture in terms of budget priorities. It's not as you know better than I do, as an appropriator, it's not, we simply can't fund everything that somebody wants to pay for. And so at the very least, if we are to have unfunded priorities list, the secretary should have eyes and ears on the process and have an opportunity to comment on the process, because the components, whether it's a military service, God bless them, or any other agency, don't always have the big picture perspective in terms of overlap with other departments and other missions.
Thank you, sir. Secretary Chertoff.
I'm in strong agreement. In fact, as we talked about earlier, one of the challenges with the department has been the sense that there has not been enough central coordination and unity of effort across the department, particularly when you have individual agencies essentially end running around the leadership of the department. So I think having individual agencies kind of go themselves and try to promote their agenda over the department's agenda would really undercut the ability of leadership to have a coordinated strategic approach. Now, it may be that the secretary and the department as a whole ought to submit a list of priorities that have not been funded, but it ought to be done as a unified effort and not as a fragmented effort.
Thank you. Both secretaries, I want to thank you all for your testimony today. Madam Chair, thank you for holding this very helpful hearing to us all. With the interest of time, I will yield back, but my sincere thanks.
Mr. Cuellar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a quick question for both of you. There are three messages that people in Latin America are hearing right now. One is from the administration, says, don't come now, come later. The second message is what I call the friends, family, neighbors message. Hey, Pedro, I just came across. You can come on over at this moment. And they see images and televisions in Latin America showing people crossing the border into the United States. And the third message is the criminal organizations that target aggressively market their services because they make a lot of money. For example, in February, if we had a little bit over 100,000 and the narcos charge them, and it varies. I have numbers here, 4,000 if you're a Mexican, if you're a unaccompanied kid from Latin America, it might go up to 7,500. So let's say an average of 6,000. So that means that on just not the getaways, but just the ones that they encounter, they made over $600 million for the month of for February. So that message, there's three messages, and I know, I think you all know this. They're listening to message number 2 and number 3. My question is, what should be the message from the administration? Because in my opinion, when they say, don't come now, come later, that's a horrible message. And Secretary Johnson, I know you and I worked on visuals, when we return people, show and be returned, because otherwise they're just seeing people coming over. And you were very good at that under the Obama administration when we had the surge in 2014, 2015. So my question is, what should be, from the opinion of both of y'all, should be the message, the counter message number 2 and number 3 from the administration?
Don't come here illegally. Period. I've had to go to Central America. And this is awkward. I've had to go to Central America, stand next to the president of the country and tell his people, don't come to my country, which is an awkward message to deliver, but it's an unambiguous one. And you're right that the smugglers, for their own economic benefit, take whatever policy statements come from the United States and they distort them, they exaggerate them, they extrapolate from them for their own benefit. And so in 2014, for example, when I would talk to the kids on the border at the Border Patrol stations, I'd ask them, why did you come here? And they would tell me, because the coyotes told me that the Border Patrol are giving out permisos, free passes, if you come to the border. And then when I would press them and say, well, what are you talking about? They would say, well, I was handed a piece of paper. It turned out the piece of paper was a notice to appear in a deportation proceeding. So a clear and unambiguous message has to be sent, accompanied by incentives or disincentives to make the dangerous journey. Processing in place, for example, which was something we tried to begin in the Obama administration, allowing people to apply for asylum in place, in country, rather than make the dangerous journey. And as I said earlier, addressing the reasons why people flee in the first place. But messaging clearly does have an impact and an effect.
Yeah, this is not a new problem. We dealt with this issue back, when I was in office, and I would agree. I think it's important to be clear and straightforward in the message that there are legal ways you may be able to come, but don't come without legal permission, whether that be asylum, and I agree with processing in place, or if you can get a temporary work visa. And as I think I've said previously, expanding some of the lawful ways people can come actually relieve some of that pressure to cross illegally. But I'd say 2 other things. We do need to look at root causes. And, if there's violence or disorder in the Northern Triangle, people are going to flee a burning building. So we need to work on that. We also need to work with our counterparts in other countries in Latin America. I read a news story today that says Mexico may start to now reinforce its southern border against migrants. So a cooperative approach with a consistency of message can be very helpful here. And finally, we need to go after the gangs because they create all kinds of problems with not just human smuggling, but drug smuggling and disorder in places like Mexico.
If I could add to that, one of the ways we dealt with the 2014 surge was we got the Mexican government to help us on their southern border. They don't have a lot of border security, border patrol on the border between Mexico and Central America, but they stepped it up and it made a difference.
And here's the article that y'all are talking about Mexico doing this. In fact, in 2014, Madam Chair, we added about $14 million to help Mexico secure the southern border. And at one time, they were actually stopping more people than Border Patrol was at their southern border. Thank you very much, both of y'all. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay. Mr. Palazzo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I think what Congressman Cuellar was mentioning was we've had these conversations in Homeland Security. You know, the Mexican southern border is a lot smaller than the American-Mexican border. And it just makes sense to push resources there and help our allies and our partners address this problem before it even makes its way to the Mexican border, southern Mexican border, or the American southern border. Real quick, again, Secretary Johnson, when I get stuck on an issue, I kind of keep beating it up. Right here, this is from Jaeda South homepage. Real quick, Coast Guard cutters offload 7,500 pounds of cocaine and marijuana. Estimated cost $126 million. Coast Guard transfers 3 smugglers over $5.6 million in seized cocaine near the U.S. Virgin Islands. Coast Guard seizes $156 million of cocaine by Coast Guard Pacific. Atlantic area-based Coast Guard cutters offload more than $330 million worth of illegal narcotics. Coast Guard Navy offload $211 million worth of cocaine, marijuana. This is all in the first 2.5 months of the year. Just what I'm seeing, and there's probably more that hasn't been reported. That's $829 million in hard narcotics that is taken off the ocean before it finds its way into our schools, our backyards, and devastating our communities. And I wish the OMB and others would take this seriously. We need more national security cutters, more offshore patrol cutters for the Coast Guard, not less. And so an NSC costs on average $670 million. It paid for itself in the first 2.5 months. Madam Chair, I hope as we go through, we can take a hard look at maybe trying to fund at least a 1-for-1 replacement in the national security cutters that replace the heavy endurance cutters. Right now, we're 1 shy, but look, we could use it. I think we need it. And so shifting gears real quick, I'm looking at press releases and hearings from 2014, Secretary Johnson, and to me, it feels like a lot of this is deja vu. Deja vu all over again. You can almost fill in the blank. President so-and-so sent a clear message of disregard to the U.S. Congress, the American people, when he enacted so-and-so like provisions by executive order. And, there's a crisis on our border. We cannot ignore that. And we have to be compassionate, right? I mean, I hear that word's tossed around, but we also need to make sure there's certain deterrents down there. And I've been a huge proponent of the National Guard. I think some of our hearings when I was on Homeland, the other Homeland Committee, we talked about utilizing the National Guard. And now, while the Border Patrol are becoming babysitters, taxi cab drivers, nurses, whatever they're doing, they are not doing their core job. And to me, that could demoralize people. They weren't hired for those positions, but we have thrust them into those areas of responsibilities. They want to be out. They want to be in the canyons. They want to be chasing those coming over illegal, smuggling drugs, people, foreign nationals and things of that nature. So can you, and Secretary Chertoff too, I know you're no stranger because, several presidents in the past have utilized the National Guard. I know they kind of fill in for the Border Patrol, but can we expand their mission on the border? And I'll give both of y'all an opportunity to address it.
Let me start, if I could. First of all, this problem always looks simpler from the comfort of a law office in Midtown Manhattan than it did when I owned the problem for 3 years, and the complexity. I suspect that the dynamic has changed over the last 7 years. So it may be a little different than how I saw it in 2014, 2015, 2016. We have to always remember that the National Guard, the US military, is limited by our laws against the posse comitatus. Congressman, I know you know that. There can be a role during surges, during emergencies for the Guard. Bottom line, the most compassionate thing we can do is address the reasons why people are leaving Central America in the first place. And I don't believe that it is an insurmountable task. We've done this before with, say, a Plan Colombia. It's just up to Congress to keep up a sustained effort at this. If we really want to address illegal migration on our southern border, I am convinced that is the answer. We can talk about the Guard, we can talk about more surveillance, more Border Patrol agents, changing our asylum laws, but so long as the problem continues to exist in Central America, we're going to continue to be banging our head against the wall, trying to find answers.
Mr. Rupert.
Okay,
Real quick, if you don't mind, Secretary Johnson and Madam Chair, I think you will find there's a lot of agreement with many of the members on the committee that would agree. We have to address the root causes, but we also have to address the immediate surge and problems that it's causing for, putting Americans in danger currently. So I think you will find some common ground if we could just get past the politics and put the American people and good policy ahead of those politics. So thank you, Secretary Johnson, for you being here, and Secretary Chertoff. Madam Chair, I'm sorry, I yield back.
Okay, Mr. Rupert.
Yes, first I agree with my friend Steve about the Coast Guard, a fantastic organization, and they have limited resources, but they do the job. I also want to acknowledge, as I did before, I think the leadership of both Secretary Johnson and Chertoff to stand up an operation, any department, and with all the missions you have, I think you really guided the ship very well in your leadership. I'm going to get into the issue of ports. I think right now, I think since the department was set up in 2002, Customs and Border Protection have made great strides in securing our southwest border. A lot more work to do. The Coast Guard, I said, has protected our waterways, and TSA has made flying safer. However, I'm not fully convinced that the Department of Homeland Security has ever truly emphasized the need to secure our seaports. The Port of Baltimore, which I represent, is an economic powerhouse, generating over 33,000 jobs, 33,900 jobs, in fact, and $2.2 billion in regional business revenue. It might not be Long Beach or Newark, but we had a banner year of 43.6 million tons in 2020, and this number includes well over 1 million 20-foot equivalent units. That's 1 million containers. So far, CBP has a lot of work to do. As some officers admitted when I visited the port, opioids, including fentanyl and cocaine, is flowing through our seaports because Baltimore is simply ill-equipped. It's not that the work ethic isn't there at CBP, but they're just ill-equipped, don't have the resources. So my question for both of you is how can DHS better position itself to intercept drugs and other contraband at our seaports? And is it simply more personnel, installation of non-intrusive inspection technology, or a change in policy and philosophy? Both of you.
I'll step up first. I think some of it is technology. I think non-invasive technologies that operate at scale and at speed can be helpful. But I think a lot of it is intelligence, and we talked about this earlier. It's collecting intelligence, both analytics about the nature of what's coming in to see what are higher risk shipments that need to be looked at, but also intelligence collection from the source points that indicate where there might be particular vessels or particular types of freight entities that are more likely to be used by smugglers. So I think it's a combination of these things. We use these techniques at the land borders as well as kind of all the above approach.
I agree with Michael. I think that continued investments in technology, surveillance, and I believe also that there is a definite role for the Coast Guard in the port security mission. Over.
Good answers. Thank you. You're back.
Mr. Rutherford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Johnson and Secretary Chertoff, first, let me say thank you both for what you accomplished while you were in office. I think y'all did a really a yeoman's job. Let me ask you about, and Secretary Johnson, I agree completely about having to fix the environment in Central America if we're really going to stop these migrants from coming. And part of what concerns me, and I think we've had some headway. I think Mr. Secretary Chertoff, you mentioned, I think Colombia, and some of the successes that we've had. I know in Honduras, for example, when we went in and assisted with the purge of the Honduran National Police, the acceptance of their law enforcement went from like 20% up to 60%. They were going through the same purge, well, sort of the same enhancement process with their courts and prosecution with Machi probably 5 years ago. So there are some good things going on to help bring justice and democracy to these countries. What concerns me is when I travel to Suriname in Guyana in South America, and I see where the Chinese have already been there, and the Chinese are in Ecuador. They now have 160 vessel fleet in the Galapagos Islands. My question is, during your time, did you see the beginnings of this Chinese move into the southwestern hemisphere?
Start. I mean, this was not a big issue when I was in office, but I've been involved in watching this ever since. And what we've seen the Chinese do, particularly under Xi Jinping, who has not really made much of a secret about it, is they've attempted to extend their tentacles all around the southern hemisphere. They've done it in the Indian Ocean, they've done it in Africa, and now they're doing it also in Latin America. And they do it with a combination of using funding for certain kinds of projects, helping particularly authoritarian governments build capabilities to repress their population, and then trying to post their assets in other parts of the world. So this is part of a larger conversation. And we obviously have Secretary of Defense who are in Asia right now, talking about the need to pull together our allies in the region to counterbalance the Chinese. But this, I think, is, to my mind, maybe the largest geopolitical challenge we face strategically over the next 4 years.
I agree. Thank you, Secretary. Secretary Johnson, would you like to add to that?
I agree with what Michael said. I would give the same answer from my perspective from the time I served.
Thank you. And listen, I would recommend to folks, there's a great report out. It's a report about 13 different countries and where the Chinese have gone in and through what they call a process of elite capture. The name of the report is The Malign Chinese Influence and the Dissolving of Democracy. And it's by the International Republican Institute. I can tell you that is a game plan. It shows exactly what the Chinese are trying to do. And they are in our backyard fulfilling that. And I think a lot of the problems that are being exacerbated down there with the drug cartels and the transnational organizations is a direct result of what's going on with the Chinese. So, but I see my time is just about up. So thank you both very much. I yield back.
Thank you. Time is almost up, but I do have one more question that I would like to ask, and it has to do with acquisitions. Major acquisitions have been a challenge for DHS. GAO has cited numerous times how the department has failed to meet scheduled and cost projections. Other challenges include systemic stovepipes within each component that can lead to duplicative programs and a failure to leverage capabilities that exist in other components. Secretary Johnson, how can DHS better integrate acquisitions to head off duplicative programs and leverage component programs and capabilities across the department? And how should we be reviewing these program requirements at the DHS level to ensure components are not pursuing stovepipe programs? Secretary, Mr. Secretary, I think you're muted.
Sorry. I'll make 2 points. In my opening statement, I noted the fact that over the last 50 months, there have been 9 people who have occupied the job of Secretary of Homeland Security. Obviously, in that kind of circumstance, no one secretary or no one undersecretary for management has the time to devote to addressing the answer to your question, which is a difficult one. We need a more mature acquisition process in DHS. The reality is, with big government contracts, big acquisitions, what looks like a good idea in year 1, which then takes 10 years to implement, by the time you get to year 7 or 8, somebody says, I can build a better bicycle. And programs will often outdate themselves given the life of the time it takes to put them in place. So I think across the federal government, we know how to do this. If DHS could learn how to embrace best practices. I suspect that the process has not improved much since 5-6 years ago when I was there, simply because there have not been people in place that have had the time and the attention span to deal with it.
Secretary Chertoff, do you have any thoughts on this?
I agree with what Jay said, and I think, part of the issue is you've got to have empowerment by the secretary of the chief acquisition officer of the department to play a role with respect to all the components. And that some of that may require some tweaks in legislation, but some of it requires consistent leadership and strategic vision. And I know when I was in office, there were times I had to call everybody in and make it clear on a regular basis that there needed to be exchange of information, cross-cutting collaboration, and ultimately a unified position on some of these issues.
I believe that finishes the second round, and I'd just like to say to Secretary Chertoff, Secretary Johnson, thank you so very much for your time, for helping us to think through these challenges. Your insights and your recommendations have truly been invaluable. If there's no further business, the Subcommittee on Homeland Security stands adjourned.